Hello, this is Joe Blair. Welcome to the Epic Human Podcast. For those who don't know, the Epic Human Podcast is where we feature risk takers, high performers, interesting people from all walks of life. And we are kicking off Season 2 at this moment. I want to thank everybody for tuning in for Season 2. We have been on a little bit of a hiatus, as you may have noticed. For the last 3 or 4 months, we've not been putting out new shows of the Epic Human Podcast. And I promise you there's a good reason for this. This good reason is in the form of a beautiful baby boy, which my wife gave birth to a few months ago. And so that's taken up a lot of my time and energy, but we're now starting to get into more of a groove with our 3 little boys. So it's lots of fun. Just want to start off by looking back on Season 1, the very first season of the Epic Human Podcast. As you may know, I had pretty humble goals for this podcast. I was hoping to do 4 for the year. I was hoping to get a few dozen listeners, basically my family and friends. And at the end of the year, we did 15 episodes, and we're now in the thousands of listeners. The show has reached folks as far as Sweden, Canada, the UK, Spain, France, Nepal, Israel, and there have even been a few people who have reached out, unsolicited, people I don't know, saying how much they love the podcast. So folks like Tiffany Lorraine and Setu Garg and Eli Scheinman, folks like that who reached out with positive feedback, but also with constructive criticism, which I do appreciate. And I'm integrating some of that feedback into the new season. So what started off as an experiment is becoming an important part of my life and something I'm really passionate about. So I'm going to continue bringing you amazing people that hopefully are inspiring you and intriguing and fascinating to you, like they are for me. Speaking of moving forward, there are some changes that you can expect for Season 2. For example, we're updating the logo, working with a fantastic designer named Kenneth Lim at by 3 p.m. And you can check him out if you're interested at www.by3pm.com. We're upgrading our equipment. I hope you can tell. Got a new setup in terms of microphone and some additional equipment. And I appreciate my cousin, Garrett Beasley, who is an audio and visual genius, does a lot of work with MIT, for being my unofficial advisor. And so appreciate him helping out, and hopefully you'll sense that the sound quality is much better this year. One other change I'm trying to make is with my intros, in terms of making the intros just much more smooth and natural. Previously I'd been writing them out and then effectively reading them, and it felt weird, and the feedback I received is it also sounded weird. So I'm just going to try to be more natural, more off the cuff, and in general would like to keep the podcast as natural and conversational as possible. And as you know, I love investigating the backgrounds of some of my guests, but one way I'm going to change it up this season is, rather than do that up front, I'm going to do that more towards the middle of the podcast, so that we can talk about, get right to who is this person, what are they working on, why are they on the show, and then we can kind of zoom out a little later and figure out, okay, and now how did you get to this point? What were some of the important experiences and influences in your life that helped you get to this point? And then the last part, it will be similar to how it's been in the past, which is, okay, what advice do you have for folks? What are the areas of your personal philosophy that helped you get this far, etc. And I'm excited that we have an amazing lineup of guests already queued up for Season 2, and we have a few other surprises in store for the Epic Human listeners that I am not announcing yet, but stay tuned for that. One other thing I wanted to mention is I haven't really covered this before, but now I wanted to share the catalyst for the Epic Human podcast. It's a bit of a personal story, and I just wrote a piece about it, so you can find that on Medium and LinkedIn and also on our Twitter handle at Epic Human Pod. But and I'm not going to read it to you, but I'm going to give you a flavor. So the inspiration was my grandmother, Eileen Blair. She's a woman who had a very challenging upbringing. She grew up in Jamaica in extreme poverty. She had six older siblings, and she lived in a one-room house with her single mother, who didn't spent all her time taking care of the children. Occasionally would take on some sewing jobs to make ends meet. And she had a father, but the father was a drunk, so he would spend whatever money he made on rum and just kind of hanging out with his friends. And so he would spend all the money before he got home and never have any money to give to her mother to buy food for the kids. So they did a lot of begging and borrowing from neighbors, and it was a tough life. And not to mention, when Eileen was 8 years old, her mother died of cancer. So she was left with her oldest brother to take care of her. And it was a rough life. I mean, she often didn't have shoes. She had to wear clothes that were thrown out, like basically found in the garbage from that neighbors had discarded. But somehow she met my grandfather, who was also from Jamaica, and they were able to immigrate to New York City, to the Bronx specifically, and that's where they built a life. I mean, this is a typical story of an American dream, where they came to a new country, they got very low-level jobs, they worked their way up, they got some education, they built a business, they built a family, they eventually bought their own house, a house in the Bronx, which is the house that I actually grew up the first part of my childhood in. So amazing story, amazing woman, all sorts of trials and challenges throughout her life. So fast forward to 8 years ago, I'm visiting my grandmother with my wife Tava. She had a conference, and I got just this amazing opportunity to spend a few days with my grandmother. And I got the sense that this might be the last time I would see her. I mean, her husband had previously died, my grandfather, and she was always in precarious health. She had a number of health issues and was always kind of in and out of doctors, in and out of the hospital. And so I got this feeling that maybe this is the last time I get to really talk to her. So I basically asked her to just tell me as many stories as you can remember. Everything from Jamaica, everything from the Bronx, what was it like? And she just went on and on, telling me every story I'd ever heard growing up, and then some. And I'm a little bit ashamed to admit that I recorded her without her permission. It's not something I'm super proud of, but I knew that if I had asked her, she would have said, no way. She was a private, humble person, and she would clam up. But I also knew if I didn't record her, that those stories and her voice would be lost forever. So I did it, and I recorded hours and hours of these conversations, stories, lessons, her personal philosophy, and then lo and behold, a few years later, she passed on. And at the funeral and the wake, my family and I, and all our cousins and aunts and uncles, we listened to those recordings. And it was so uplifting and I don't know. So I don't know what the right word is, but it was uplifting, and it was peaceful. It gave us some peace just to be able to hear her voice, and and remember her in that way. And this was what got me thinking about the power of the human voice. Our voices are as distinct to us as our fingerprints, and nothing brings a story or an experience to life like an impassioned storyteller and an impassioned voice. And so this podcast is all about bringing folks like Eileen to the forefront. So people who are not necessarily rich, famous people you've heard of, but people who have incredible stories of triumph over adversity, of taking risks, of stepping off the preordained path, of following their passions. And that's what this podcast is all about. And it's all inspired by my grandmother, Eileen Blair. So now you have that context. We're super excited for this season 2. I think you're going to love the guests that we have in mind. And just want to say again, thanks for listening. I'm eternally humbled and grateful that you're out there listening. And feel free to follow us on Epicumen Pod, at Epicumen Pod on Twitter or Facebook. Maybe eventually we'll get Instagram and YouTube going. Or just continue to subscribe on your podcasting app. That's totally fine too. But appreciate you listening. And if you have ideas for folks who would be good guests, feel free to reach out. The benefit of being, pretty small right now is that I can pretty much respond to anyone who reaches out. That may not be true for long, but so far it's possible. So I appreciate you, and I hope you enjoy season 2 of the Epicumen podcast. Thanks so much.